as we watch the Prime Minister's front door there for him to come out. I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellas, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen here in our Parliamentary Bureau. Good to see you both. We'll start with this seniors package, Vashi, because I know you too were getting inundated by many seniors tweeting or emailing. When exactly is this going to happen? And I think we're going to find that out today.
Yeah, the announcement was made back in the middle of May, and you're absolutely right. A number of seniors have written in, and they were wondering when the exact date of delivery would be, because many of them are already getting their checks, for example, through OAS or the GIS program, the Guaranteed Income Supplement. You're absolutely right. It's up to $500 if you do receive the GIS. And my understanding is that the Prime Minister will say that those checks will start being delivered, or the money rather, will start being delivered the week of July 6th. So I imagine that will be very welcome news for a lot of seniors who are counting on that money to help them. And I would remind our viewers that the intent is to help them with sort of those incremental extra costs due to the shutdown, due to the closing of so many things in the economy. So for example, if you couldn't take public transit anymore, you had to take a taxi or an Uber, or you had to get your groceries delivered, or just the sheer cost of groceries, which we know everyone can feel has certainly increased. This is the amount of money that the government designated for that. And in that vein, I would raise the other point that I have heard from a number of people, a number of Canadians living with disabilities, who are also experiencing the same rise in incremental costs. They also live, so many of them, of course, most of them, on a fixed income. There's some shared jurisdiction here between the province and the federal government, but they are also, and they have been asking from the start of this pandemic, if they will receive something similar to what seniors got. So some type of one-time payment that will help them with their incremental costs. A few weeks ago, or maybe actually the middle of May, Minister Qualtrough, the minister for both Canadians with disabilities and employment, had signaled that there was something coming. And I believe there was an exchange in the House of Commons that said there could be an announcement on that by the end of the week. I raise it because I've also heard from so many Canadians with disabilities who are wondering about that and whether or not the government will make good on its sort of signaling that something is coming. And so we are anticipating something hopefully this week in that vein as well. And then also on the Prime Minister's front in his remarks, I am anticipating some remarks directed towards the premiers and the weekly call that they have that will take place this week. My understanding is the focus will really be on reopening the economy and a quote-unquote safe restart. And of course, all of that involves testing and contact tracing, something we've talked about and listened to from various experts a lot lately. And that's because it is so significant as we look towards what might be coming, what this modeling might show us about the potential for a second wave. That coordination between the federal government and the provinces where testing and contact tracing and boosting capacity is concerned is going to be so significant.
And we know that the Prime Minister has previously talked about that national app that he is looking at, and a decision I think he indicated would have to be made sometime at the beginning of June in order to tap into some of the data from Apple and Google. So maybe worth asking about him about that as well. I'll send a note to Tom Perry immediately. Catherine, I know you too have been looking at the seniors benefit because it is a little frustrating, I think, for some seniors that it has taken this long and actually will take another month to get it to them.
Well, that's right. When the announcement was first made on May 12th, they weren't given a particular date. And my sense from talking to officials is perhaps this is taking longer than, frankly, the federal government would like as well. We're talking about, according to Vashi's reporting there, nearly 2 months in order to get this money out the door. So I've been asking officials, why is that the case? I'm told part of it has to do with setting up a new mechanism. Essentially, it's a technical issue. In order to get this money out the door to the people who need it, they have to get the appropriate checks and balances in place. 6.7 million seniors who are waiting for this money, be it the whole $500 or just the OAS portion of that. And so the federal government not necessarily happy about that, but trying to let people know that indeed this money is coming. The database that they're working with, officials tell me, more than half a century old for OAS, something that they were looking at updating before this, but it now, like so many other issues surrounding COVID-19, has become a pressing issue. Now, some of these people, of course, did receive that GST boost for low-income Canadians. Seniors, of course, would have been included in that, but the federal government has indicated by making this announcement that they know that some seniors, particularly low-income seniors, do need this money. And you and Vashi have talked about the people writing to you saying that this could make an important difference for seniors in Canada who may be facing increased costs having to do with grocery delivery and any other number of things as well. So waiting for that money, and today we'll get a bit more of an explanation of why it's taken so long and when they might see it in their accounts. Rosie.
Okay, I'll leave you both there for just one moment, if you don't mind, while I touch on a topic that we discussed, what we asked the Prime Minister about 2 days ago. He was on international calls yesterday and didn't have a briefing, but it was, of course, the reaction to the racism protests in the United States over the course of the past week or more now, since the death of George Floyd, which really haven't slowed down in any way in the United States, although they have calmed down a little bit. They are much more peaceful because of the way, I guess, the police are choosing to handle things in many of those states. Today, though, marks the first of a number of memorials set for George Floyd. Today will be happening at 2 Eastern. We'll have some coverage of that, of course, on this network, followed by his funeral in Houston later this week. But it has, of course, caused this country to ask some questions about how we are dealing with anti-Black racism in this country. And it's something that Marie-Claude Landry has been working on. She's the Chief Commissioner for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and she is in Sherbrooke. Nice to see you, Madame Landry.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me, Rosemary.
No, a pleasure. So one of the things that has struck me over the past couple of days is the inability for some people to acknowledge systemic racism in this country. And I'm sure you're well aware, one of those people is the Premier of Quebec. Why is that happening still, do you think? Why is there such a reluctance to admit that racism is systemic in this country?
Let me say that first, that for me, I really believe that people who are thinking that there is no racism in Canada is itself a barrier to addressing it. It's a huge issue, and the first step to resolve this pervasive situation is certainly to admitting that there is racism and systemic discrimination toward Black people in Canada. We need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to reflect on our white privilege. This is key.
And so just to go back to, maybe you could explain to some people that still don't get that concept of systemic racism. How do you explain that to people? How do you interpret that?
It's, you know, if I'm going to in the store, in the drugstore, or in the grocery, or in some restaurant, has a white woman or has for a white man, they will not be followed or targeted, or the behavior will be different. And it's obvious, as it's not the same thing for a white person. And I think that we're seeing that as well in the employment and the number of Black people who can reach executive function or higher job. And it's everywhere. Racism in Canada is everywhere. And this is something that we need to think about, to question ourselves. We need to question our own behavior, our own attitude, and also to speak out when we're seeing something around the table. As an example, if we are part of a discussion and someone have a behavior where they have racist argument, that we need to speak out about that. We cannot remain silent. Silence makes us complicit of what's going on.
So what happens, though, when a leader, a public figure, like the Premier of Quebec, for instance, denies that there's systemic racism? How challenging, then, is it for someone like you, who's battling this every day, trying to raise awareness, to undo those ideas, given the platform that he has?
As a national institution leader, as a national institution for human rights leader, it's not my place to comment on any comments from politicians or people. What I should say, and what I keep saying, is there is racism and systemic discrimination in Canada, as everywhere in the world, and we need to admit it, we need to acknowledge it. And this is, if we're not doing it, we will never resolve this issue. And it's an historic moment in the world where everyone get together to say that there is racism, enough is enough, we need to address what's going on. It's not normal that someone should be or will be targeted because of the color of his skin. And if we want to talk about racism, we just have to read this study in Montreal about racial profiling. We just have to read the study of the Ontario Human Rights Commission about racial profiling. And there is one as well in Nova Scotia. Then how can we say that there is no racism in Canada?
One of the things that has been part of the conversation is how police are funded in this country. Do you think we need to have a re-examination of how much money police are given in cities and whether that is the right place for that money to go, given that we've also done numerous investigations here at the CBC about how people with mental health and substance abuse problems are usually not handled properly by police?
But I don't think that it's my job to comment on how they found police. What I should say is we all need to have a close look on how we behave, and we all need to learn. We all need to read about the history of Black people in this country and everywhere in the world. We need to understand how they contribute to build this country, and we need to ask ourselves very difficult and uncomfortable questions. You know, and Mary, I have Black people in my own family. How come I should explain to my grandson and my daughter that they should take care, they should be careful when they are walking back from school, they should behave in another way? While I think that this is the society need to change, we need to have a close look on how we behave toward Black people.
Has the Canadian government done enough to deal with anti-Black racism?
We all need to get together to do more about anti-Black racism. We all need to do more to be aware of what's going on. We all need to be united to address racism in this country. And it starts by acknowledging that we have racism in Canada, and we need to question how we are doing with it.
Okay, Marie-Claude Landry, thank you so much for making the time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.
Marie-Claude Landry is the Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. She was in Sherbrooke, Quebec today. We are standing by, of course, to wait for the Prime Minister to come out and give us his daily briefing today, expecting him to talk, as we were discussing there, about when seniors can expect that one-time top-up, either to their old age security supplement benefit or to the guaranteed income supplement as well, if they receive both. That would be a total of $500, $300 if it's just the OAS. But let me bring back my colleagues, Vashi and Catherine, to talk a little bit more about the modeling picture, which we are going to get at noon. So there was initially a lot of pressure on the federal government to get those numbers released. Eventually, when they had enough from the provinces to give a picture of things, they gave us one. And the last one we got was at the end of April. I think the end of April. And at that time, it showed really that the cases were slowing down in a significant way. What we've seen since that, of course, is that Ontario remains problematic. We've got 2 minutes for until the Prime Minister comes out, but that Ontario remains problematic, Vashi. So I wonder if it will be a national picture that is very encouraging, but maybe doesn't reflect exactly what's happening in Ontario, where we are really still stuck in phase one of how we're reopening.
Yeah, and I think actually it will be interesting to see if it can reflect that, because
yes,
I think the differences, particularly between Ontario and the rest of the country, but Ontario, and you could almost group Quebec at certain points into that as well, have become accentuated over the past few weeks, and definitely since that last modeling scenario was presented by the federal government and by federal public health officials. So whereas we have seen, and you've shown many times on this show, less than 100 cases in the rest of Canada, we're still seeing, nearly 400 new cases a day in Ontario alone. And I wonder to what degree that affects the overall curve in the country and how much weight we can then put on the national picture, because it truly is now two very different stories depending where you live in this country. And I think there are, I'm keen to see it. I think it's always important to attach the caveat around it that it is not a crystal ball, and those public health officials have told us over and over again, it's not going to tell us exactly what's going to happen in 2 weeks, but I am interested to see a reflection on sort of that accentuated difference in different areas of the country and what that means going ahead, and especially as we gear our minds over to the possibility of a second wave, which could be just a few months away or 3 months away, maybe, let's say. What do things look like as we track towards that, and how much will contact tracing and testing, make a difference based on what we're seeing now?
Yeah, and I should tell people in the rest of the country, if you're not following as closely as people living in Ontario are, they did extend the state of emergency in this province again to the end of the month, which means that really very little has changed in this province compared to some other places in the country where there's a very careful but vast reopening of the economy. That is not happening in Ontario really in any significant way at all, in parts because of the number of cases. I think we're still at more than 300 today, and that makes it challenging. I'll bring you in, Catherine, knowing I might have to cut you off. That makes it challenging for the province to reopen, even as we see other provinces going forward, again, in a cautious way, but moving forward pretty aggressively.
And when we do look at these modeling projections, Rosemary, doesn't look like we're going to have a lot to say about it because the Prime Minister is stepping out the door there, but we can touch on that when he's done.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Catherine. Here is the Prime Minister of Canada now.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Earlier today, Canada took part in a replenishment conference for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which was hosted by the United Kingdom. Gavi does incredibly important work around the globe, delivering vaccines to some of the world's most vulnerable. They've also been helping developed countries to respond to outbreaks like COVID-19. Gavi saves lives, and Canada is doing its part. Now I want to turn to what is happening later today. This afternoon, we'll be releasing new modeling on COVID-19 in Canada. We'll have more details then, but for now I want to talk about the main takeaways for these projections. The data shows that we are continuing to make progress in the fight against this virus. In many communities, the number of new cases is low, and we can trace where they came from. That's an encouraging sign that the virus is slowing, and in some places, even stopping. But I want to be very clear. We're not out of the woods. The pandemic is still threatening the health and safety of Canadians. Across the country, and especially in areas where we continue to see large numbers of new cases, as well as in places like long-term care facilities and seniors' homes, the situation remains serious. So while we start loosening some restrictions, we also have to strengthen other measures like testing and contact tracing. And as people head back to work, it's even more important that we keep a 2-meter distance from others, wash our hands, and wear a mask where physical distancing is not always possible. This is key to keeping us safe and keeping the situation under control.
Later today, we will be making public the latest projections. The good news is that the data show that we are clearly slowing the spread of the virus across the country. But we're not out of the woods yet. COVID-19 is still a threat to the health and safety of Canadians. The situation remains serious, particularly in regions where there are a lot of new cases and in long-term care facilities and seniors' homes. So even though we're starting to reopen the economy to a certain extent, we must tighten up other activities such as contact tracing and testing. As people return to work, that will become even more important. We will have to continue to wash our hands, keep a 2-meter distance from others, and wear a mask where physical distancing is not always possible. In other words, we will or may lose the progress we've made if we don't, and thus we must continue to protect our seniors. Even if we're starting to reopen the economy now, our parents and grandparents must continue to stay home as much as possible. Confinement has an impact on their mental health, on their personal finances, and their quality of life.
When this crisis first started, our seniors could count on a strong public pension system for steady income. The Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, and the Guaranteed Income Supplement were our first line of defense. But over time, this pandemic has made life more expensive. Seniors haven't been able to take public transit. They haven't been able to go to a store or shop the sales because of the virus. Instead, they've had to rely on deliveries to get things they need, and it adds up. And what makes things even harder is the fact that this is the new normal for many of them, at least for a little while. Even as we start to reopen parts of the economy, many seniors will have to stay home for longer to protect their health. And that's really weighing on them. So our government stepped up to help them weather this storm. In April, more than 4 million low-income seniors received a GST credit top-up, worth an average of $375 for people who are single and $510 for couples, automatically in their bank accounts. This was a first step. We also announced that people receiving old age security would get an extra $300 to offset some of the extra costs they've had to cover because of the virus. And to give even more support to low-income seniors, we said that seniors on the Guaranteed Income Supplement would get an additional $200. That means if you are one of the 2.2 million elders receiving both OAS and GIS, you'll get an additional $500 to help you with everyday expenses. And today, I can confirm that you'll be getting that money the week of July 6th. This COVID crisis is tough on seniors, and that's why these additional funds will make a difference, with up to $900 for single seniors and up to $1,500 for couples.
Since this crisis began, we have taken a number of steps to help seniors with their daily expenses. In April, more than 4 million seniors with a low income received more money directly into their bank account when we provided GST credit top-up. We're talking about $375 on average for single seniors and $510 for couples. We also announced that we would provide an extra $300 to people on OAS and an additional $200 to people who are also on the Guaranteed Income Supplement. And today, I can confirm that people will receive that money in the week of July 6th. So, in all, because of this crisis, seniors alone could receive up to $900 and couples could receive up to $1,500. At the same time, we are supporting programs and organizations that improve the quality of life of seniors. For example, we are investing in the New Horizons program to allow affiliated organizations to adjust their services to the realities of the pandemic and help people to stay in contact with their families. We are also providing funding to partners such as the United Way, Community Partnership, and the Red Cross to provide additional services to vulnerable seniors. Now, as we're looking to reopen the economy, we must not forget that we're not all in the same circumstances. A lot of people, including elders, will have to remain vigilant and follow the specific public health advice in order to protect their health. And our government will be there to support them. Later tonight, I will be talking to the premiers of the provinces and territories at our weekly call. We will be continuing the discussions we began last week on reopening the economy safely, including funding that was announced for the municipalities earlier this week. Once again, thank you for being with us.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, on va commencer la période de questions aujourd'hui par le téléphone. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Kate Belangaro, Bloomberg. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You've delayed the decision on whether to ban Huawei from Canada's 5G networks. All of our Five Eyes allies have done it. Canadian companies are deciding not to work with them. Are you delaying this because you're afraid of Xi Jinping, yes or no?
Every step of the way, we have listened to our security agencies, our intelligence services, worked with our allies. We will make the right decision for Canadians to both keep Canadians and businesses safe, while at the same time ensuring competitiveness in our telecom industry.
At every step of the way, we have been following the recommendations of our intelligence agencies and other experts. We are working with our colleagues right around the world on this particular issue. We want to ensure that we can protect Canadians and businesses while remaining competitive in the telecom sector.
You spent a a lot of time campaigning for a spot for Canada on the UN Security Council. There are some concerns that Canada is too close to the U.S. to get a seat and will simply promote the American agenda. Is it fair to consider Canada an American Trojan horse at the UN, yes or no?
I think we have demonstrated over the past years with our deep commitment to multilateralism, our commitment to progressive trade in this era of globalization. We've become the only G7 country that has a free trade deal with every single other G7 country. We know that engaging around the world is important both for Canadians' health and well-being, but also for the good of our economy. We have done that consistently. Over the past years, I've been stepping up on drawing together questions around financing for development in small island developing states and in Africa. These are things that Canadians have done in the past and will continue to do because we know that it makes a difference. Even as some of our allies, including the United States, seem to withdraw from the world, Canada is engaging in strong and confident ways as Canadians expect us to.
Merci. Opérateur, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Raymond Filion, TVA. À vous.
Thank you. Good morning, Prime Minister. Your long silence on Tuesday caused a lot of people to be talking and speculating about what it meant. Could you please explain? Well, I think everyone is looking at what is happening in the United States with tremendous concern and anxiety, and we will continue both to follow what's happening in the U.S., but also to look at what we can and must do in our own country. Canadians are facing discrimination every single day. And we need to have a government there to respond to the challenges they face. And that means working all together to be better allies, and that's what we will do.
Canadians continue to watch with consternation and horror what's going on in the United States right now. But that can't keep us from looking very carefully at our own systems and the work that we need to do to make sure that the millions of Canadians who face discrimination and intolerance every single day in their lived reality get better support, have Canadians come forward as allies, have a government that continues to work with them to break down barriers and make sure that everyone is treated with respect and given all the opportunities that others have.
En suivi, Raymond?
Follow up. A lot of people interpreted your silence as a nonverbal denunciation of President Trump. Is that the case? Well, I think Canadians expect that I be there to defend their interests and their values. That's what I've always done in relation to the United States and in relation to every country around the globe, and I will continue to do that.
Canadians expect their Prime Minister to stand up for their values and their interests, and that's what I've done my entire time as Prime Minister, whether it be with the United States or with other countries around the world.
Thank you. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous.
Merci, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. About the Army in the long-term care facilities, you set a deadline. Now, can you tell us whether you've made a decision and whether you're going to extend that deadline? Well, I first want to reassure seniors in Quebec that the government will be there for them. We've been there right from the beginning with the Army. We're still there, and we will continue to provide help and support in various ways so that we can get through these tough times. The discussions are still underway with the government of Quebec as to how Canada can help, but we will be there. Follow up, Mélanie. But what exactly is your offer? To send in fewer soldiers or to provide 4 additional months of help from the Army? Well, our priority is to ensure that seniors in Quebec are properly protected and are receiving the care that is necessary during this pandemic and this difficult situation. Canada will continue to support Quebec to regain control of the situation in those centres and of the system as a whole. And we are currently in discussion with the province as to the best way to accomplish that.
We will ensure that elders in Quebec are given the protection and the support that they need. We have been there, we are there, and we will continue to help out. We're in discussions right now with the province of Quebec on how we can best help as we move forward to ensure that all seniors in Quebec are properly cared for.
Merci. Opérateur, dernière question au téléphone.
Thank you. Merci. Last question. Andrea Gunn, the Chronicle Herald. Line open.
Hi there, Prime Minister. The Nova Scotia government is saying that they will complete an inquiry, a public inquiry into the shooting that occurred in April, but only if the federal government launches it and takes a lead on it. Is that something that your government is prepared to do?
We have been in very close conversation with the provincial government on this. We recognize that Nova Scotians, and indeed all Canadians, have significant questions about what happened. The RCMP is continuing its detailed investigation into the events, but there also needs to be a larger review. Canada will work with Nova Scotia on ensuring that it happens in the right way.
As a follow-up?
So you're committing to doing some sort of public or a review with the province on this?
We know people have questions that need answering, and we will work with Nova Scotia to make sure that happens.
Bonjour, Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada,
Il y a plusieurs personnes qui ont critiqué votre silence, que ce soit Yves-François Blanchet qui a dit que vous manquiez de colonne, Job Meeting qui a dit que c'était hypocrite parce que quand il y a des gens qui sont intimidés, le silence, ça ne les aide pas, il faut se lever debout et les défendre.
Some people are saying silence is no good, you have to stand up and defend people. And other people are saying it wouldn't take me 20 seconds to denounce what's happening. Why can you not denounce what is currently happening in the United States when the black community needs allies? You say you're an ally, but all you're giving them is silence. Well, Canada will continue to support and stand up for all minorities right across the country and across the world. That's what we've always done and we will always do. My job as a Prime Minister is to defend Canadian values and to stand up for our principles, but at the same time protect the interests of all Canadians and help Canadians, and that's what I always do. As a government, we have done a great deal by working with the black community here in Canada, but we still have a lot to do, and we will continue to work.
My job as Prime Minister is to stand up for Canadians' values, to express those values, and to ensure that I'm standing up for Canadians' interests as well, and I'm defending those interests. I will continue to do that. In regards to defending racialized Canadians and supporting people all around the world in the fight against racism, I will continue to do that. We have done much hand in hand with the black community over these past years on supporting them, on reducing barriers, but we recognize there is much more to do here in Canada, right across the country. We will continue to do that work.
Vous dites que vous tenez debout, mais
you say that you're standing up for them, but it's through your silence. Now, is that because of your concern about offending the Trump administration, maybe saying the wrong thing that might irritate the president, and that could lead to repercussions on the border or free trade? Is that what you're afraid of? Are you afraid you might make some offensive comments, like at the G7, that would upset our neighbor to the south? My job is to defend Canadians and ensure that everyone is familiar with the values of all Canadians here and around the world. That's what I've been doing, and that's what I will always do.
Stand up for Canadians' well-being and Canadians' interests while making it very clear what Canadians' values are. That's exactly what I've done.
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Video emerged this week of an RCMP officer in Nunavut driving his truck into an Inuk man. That follows a pattern of police brutality in the province, with 3 police-involved shootings and 2 fatalities since February. What is your response to the video in particular, and who should be held accountable for this?
We recognize in Canada that there are systemic discrimination problems, that we need to address our justice system. We need to address challenges in our society that are a lived reality for racialized Canadians, for Indigenous Canadians. Even as we watch with horror what's going on in the United States, we know we have an awful lot of work to do right here in Canada. As a government, we have taken steps towards that, but as you point out, there's much more to do.
And
We acknowledged that Canada is facing systemic discrimination that affects our justice system and many of our institutions and circumstances that affect Canadians of various origins. And that's why, as a government, we have taken concrete action in recent years, but we do realize there's still much more to be done, and we will continue to work to be better allies to all Canadians, Black Canadians and those of other visible minorities.
Sending to Indigenous people when you are responding to my questions with a talking point you've used all week, rather than responding to the video. You say you are responding to what's happening in the U.S. with horror and consternation, and you're not expressing those same things for what's happening in your own country.
I have said from the very beginning that Canada is not immune or exempt from the things that we see going on in the United States. Racialized Canadians, Indigenous Canadians have long suffered systemic discrimination in every part of this country. And even though we have taken significant steps over the past years, there is much more to do. And the events of these past weeks in Canada and in the United States have underlined how much more work we have to do, and we will be there to do it hand in hand as allies to the Black community, to Indigenous peoples, and to all racialized Canadians.
Hello, Prime Minister. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. Many Black Lives Matter advocates are demanding that governments defund police and instead redirect that money into disadvantaged communities. The mayor of LA, for example, announced that they will be cutting the LAPD's budget by hundreds of millions of dollars. Are you willing to cut the RCMP's budget?
I think there are many different paths towards making a better country, and we need to explore the range of them. We need to look at what's appropriate in Canada, how we can best keep Canadians safe, and how we can best address the systemic racism that exists in far too many parts of our country and far too many of our institutions. We will do that as a government. We will ensure that we are supporting community organizations that need support, supporting anti-Black racism programs, supporting Indigenous peoples, as well as doing the things we need to do to keep all Canadians safe.
Does that mean you're open to it?
We need to look at what is appropriate in Canada, and I think we need to continue to work on ways with the communities affected, with Indigenous peoples, with racialized Canadians, to take the measures that they need. We have put significant funding towards frontline organizations in the Black community. We have funded Indigenous communities significantly. There is more to do, and we will focus on that.
On a separate subject, it is now illegal in Hong Kong to insult the national anthem. It's a move that's widely seen as yet another infringement on freedom of expression. What specifically is Canada doing to push back against this escalation and to ensure that people fleeing prosecution in Hong Kong are welcomed in Canada?
We have worked with some of our closest allies, including the UK, Australia, and others, to condemn the actions taken by China in Hong Kong. We are extremely concerned with their stepping away from the one system, one country, two systems agreement that was signed a few decades ago. We need to ensure that rights are defended all around the world, including in Hong Kong. We will continue to be a country that is open and welcoming to people fleeing persecution and violence. We
have been working with our allies around the world to express our deep concern about what's happening in Hong Kong. We have an obligation to retain the principles of two systems, one country, and unfortunately, Beijing is moving away from that principle, and we're very concerned about the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong who, of course, would be welcome to return to Canada at any time. But we also have a system here that welcomes people fleeing persecution and violence from around the world.
Minister Janet Silver, Global News. Staying with China, will your government bar Chinese passenger planes arriving from China, arriving here in Canada, as the U.S. has done, and to pick up on what you were saying with regards to Hong Kong and protecting human rights? Will you join parliamentarians in CANZAC countries to demand a special human rights envoy to monitor human rights in Hong Kong?
We are going to continue to make the international flights measures in place protect Canadians. We have taken significant steps to ensure that COVID-19 does not get transported across international borders into Canada. We will continue to keep the appropriate measures in place based on public health recommendations, based on expert assessments of what is needed to do to keep Canadians safe from COVID-19. We continue to work with partners and allies around the world on ways to ensure that China knows that its actions in Hong Kong are deeply troubling, are of real concern for the sake of people in Hong Kong, but elsewhere around the world as well. We will continue to speak up strongly and be there for people who are worried about their futures in Hong Kong.
We will continue to work with our international partners to talk about our concerns regarding the decisions being made by China about Hong Kong. With respect to international flights, we will continue to follow experts' recommendations as to what we must do to ensure the protection and safety of Canadians from COVID-19.
I'd like to take it back to Huawei. A top spokesperson at the U.S. State Department said today that if Canada allows Huawei into its 5G network and into its national security systems, the U.S. is going to have to make an assessment as to whether it can continue to share intelligence with Canada. Now, you've been mulling this over for a long time. You've said you're taking all security factors into account. You've said you're talking to security agencies, Canada's security agencies. You've said you're speaking to the allies. So I'd like to ask you specifically, are you prepared to risk losing access to U.S. intelligence if you go ahead and allow Huawei in?
These are considerations that we have been looking very carefully at. Obviously, conversations have been extensive with all our Five Eyes allies, including the United States, as we continue to work with our security intelligence agencies on the right path forward for Canada.
As I've said a number of times, we are continuing our discussions with allies, including the United States, on this decision. We will continue to listen to the recommendations from our security and intelligence agencies in order to make the right decision for all Canadians. Thank you all very much.
And that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Thursday with his daily briefing on the pandemic, giving us a couple of hints around the modeling data that we expect to hear more about at the top of the hour, showing that there are the country is making progress, but asking Canadians to still continue doing what we have been doing for so many months: physical distancing, washing our hands, and all those things. So I'll bring in my colleagues, Vashi Kapellas and the CBC's Catherine Cullen. Vashi, you're quite right. The benefits rolling out the week of July 6th. Over to you.
I gotta say, my phone's already lighting up with a number of seniors who were watching and anxiously awaiting that date. There are, as Catherine raised, a number of questions from them about what's taking so long. So I'm interested. My knowledge so far is that there's some sort of antiquated systems at work here, and it's not the same as with the CRB, where you just kind of click a button and the money ends up going into your account. But I think there is some anxiety on the parts of seniors who have already, because this pandemic is now 3 months old, had to pay a lot of those extra incremental costs. And so some questions about whether that money is coming too late. But at the same time, I'm hearing from a lot of people who are glad that it is coming at all and that they know when they are set to receive it, which is the week of July 6th. A number of things, that press conference covered a huge number of subjects, and I guess I'll pick a couple of them. First of all, a lot of questions following up on our colleague Tom Perry's question to the Prime Minister a few days ago, which of course made headlines right around the world, the one that asked him to comment specifically on the actions of Donald Trump during the protests, and specifically, deploying members of the military and an increased police presence and tear gas in order to make way for that photo op, that now infamous photo op of the president holding a Bible in front of the church. The Prime Minister at the time paused for 21 seconds, and over the ensuing number of hours, members of particularly the NDP, the New Democratic Party in this country, started to criticize him for that and say that he shouldn't have stayed silent, that he should be more specifically criticizing the actions that the president is taking. The Prime Minister was asked multiple times today about that pause and whether it reflects sort of a hesitancy and to comment on the president, and if that is a bad thing. I'm paraphrasing what the questions were, but he again, did not go there. Basically, he did not go specifically to the president's but did repeat a lot of what we've heard so far from him and his ministers, which is, a condemnation of what's happening south of the border, certainly insofar as the very blatant displays of racism caught on tape and the horrified reaction that's ensued. But he also sort of reflects back on the situation here in Canada, and that the problem is not one that we don't have, that it is a problem here as well, and that his government, he keeps saying, is doing a lot of stuff, but could be doing more and will be doing more. So I thought that was important to touch on, just because how many questions he got around that. I think it also reflects sort of the international pickup of that answer, and the fact that it did make headlines around the world, and that pause certainly caught a lot of people's eyes. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on Huawei, and our colleague Katie Simpson. Tom Perry was asking a question based on some of her reporting that we're going to see shortly, in which a spokesperson for the State Department essentially says that Canada would be jeopardizing its intelligence sharing relationship, or the U.S. would have to review that relationship, which of course is as central as it gets to intelligence in this country right now, if we went ahead with allowing Huawei to enter 5G networks in this country. That's a decision the government has been mulling what seems like forever. And based on the Prime Minister's answer, I didn't get the sense that the decision was coming down anytime soon, and that's probably because of so many other factors he didn't talk about, but including the detainment of two Canadians in China, but also the court proceedings for Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. It's an extremely complicated issue, but Tom's question was a great one, in that it has been, the government has been mulling this decision for a really long time. And to what degree are you taking into account what the U.S. is saying, which is essentially, if you do go that way, you're jeopardizing a really, really significant part of the relationship.
Yeah, and in the meantime, as they continue to kick that can down the road, the companies are making other decisions. Bell Canada, for instance, this week deciding that they were going to go with Ericsson and not Huawei. So at some point, the market may make the decision for them. I'm not sure if that's what they're hoping for, but that certainly seems to be the direction that they're going in. I will say on the questions around his pause around what the president was doing, while we rightly ask those questions, it would be extremely unusual for a world leader to speak out, for the Canadian government to speak out against the U.S. administration. I mean, we try to get the Prime Minister to be as forthcoming about his opinions and his observations that he's seeing with Donald Trump, but we know that is an extremely difficult line that the government continues to walk. So yes, there has been questions about whether he went far enough, but again, it's a difficult one for any government, conservative or liberal, when they're dealing with our biggest trading partner. Catherine, what struck you about all that?
I'd like to jump in on that, though, Rosemary, and just hold up for scrutiny, though, what the Prime Minister is saying. He was saying today, I have spoken up for Canadian values. I continue to speak up for Canadian values. The question from Tom Perry, our colleague, the other day was about the president calling in the military on protesters, using tear gas for a photo op. I think the Prime Minister would not say that those kinds of actions constitute things that are in line with Canadian values. At the same time, his response is that I am standing up for Canadians. He seems to be indicating, or my impression of what he is saying, is that it is not necessarily in Canadians' interest to speak up against those things, and yet this is the paradox here. He continues to say, I'm a spokesperson for Canadian values. Very few Canadians, I think, would value that. I also thought his answer on defunding the police, cutting the budget of the RCMP, was a very interesting one. He did, I think we can say, to some extent leave the door open. He did not say such a thing was off the table, but really the focus of his remarks, and he was pressed by our colleague at CTV about that, was about investing in community organizations, investing in anti-racism groups. So not showing great interest in that possibility, but not closing the door either, at a time where this is very much a topic of discussion, given, yes, what's going on in the United States, but also how that has put the spotlight on racism in Canada, and particular instances of racism, some of which he was asked about during that press conference as well.
Yeah, I mean, mean, that would have been an area where he possibly could have weighed in a little more, given his public safety minister was a chief of police for Toronto, given that I only know this because my whole podcast today was about this with my pal Elamine, that the vast majority of police forces across this country are the largest portion of municipal budgets. And there is a conversation about whether it continues to make sense and whether there shouldn't be other places where money could be spent. Not that you get rid of the police altogether necessarily, although there are certainly some people calling for that, but that you look at other ways to de-escalate, to prevent, and all those different things. And that is a conversation to me that seems like a legitimate policy question for all levels of government in this country, and that you may want to weigh in on. But again, you're quite right. He didn't go that far down the road, although he didn't close the door either.
Part of the discussion about changes to policing, for instance, can involve things like additional training, putting body cameras, for instance, on all police officers, things like that. Of course, they cost money, and some of the people that we're hearing, particularly around Black Lives Matter, saying additional investments in the police is not the way to make this better. In fact, as you say, there is some discussion in some circles about removing funding from police entirely and replacing them with some sort of more community-minded force, and so it was interesting to see how the Prime Minister, to what extent he was willing to engage in that particular discussion.
Okay, I'll leave it there with both of you just for a moment, if you don't mind. I'll get back to you. Thank you very much, Catherine and Vashi. But we're going to turn our minds back to what we know is an ongoing situation that the Prime Minister did refer to there in terms of some of the modeling numbers that we are going to see in around 9 minutes' time at the federal briefing, and that is the ongoing situation in long-term care homes in this country, specifically in Quebec and in Ontario, where the military have been brought in to shore up personnel and help with the outbreaks in those facilities. They are, of course, the cause of most of the deaths in this country, the deaths at long-term care centres. Dr. Gaétan Barrette has seen those challenges firsthand as a volunteer at a care home, and he is the former Quebec Health Minister. He's currently a Liberal MNA. Mr. Barrette, thank you for making the time. I've tried to get you on a couple times, but it's been busy, so thank you for coming back, and I appreciate it very much. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. Thank you.
Good. So tell me why you decided to get directly involved. You're, of course, a doctor, but why did you decide you were going to get directly involved at the long-term care centres, the CHSLDs in Quebec?
Because the crisis was at a level as it was, and I didn't go there to practice medicine. I really went there to practice orderly's work on a daily basis for a couple of weeks, because there was so many people lacking over there during a short period of time that something had to be done, and I participated, and I was very happy to have done that.
So it was orderly work, as you say, personal support work. What were you struck by when doing that work, which is very demanding work, I should say? What were you struck by?
Well, the work is demanding. I've done that in my life when I was younger. It didn't change that much, but the lack of personnel, that was what was striking. The number of people that were there that were not trained in the beginning because they were giving a hand, they were helping others, and the lack of people that was there, it was quite impressive. Where I went, I didn't see what we saw in other facilities. Things were not that bad, but they were bad enough to go there in any case.
Now, of course, you were the Minister of Health at one point. Were you aware that things were so bad in CHSLDs, or were you in a position to fix any of that when you were the minister?
What we saw was crisis dependent. On a regular basis, things were not ideal, that's for sure, but they were not at that level. What we saw specifically in the Greater Montreal area is people leaving their jobs. Many people kept coming to their jobs, but what we saw was really peculiar and really limited to the crisis period. But the situation was not good enough. So when I was in office, I put in place a pilot project in order to establish, in collaborations with unions and personnel, all categories, what would be the ideal ratio, patient personnel ratio, in order to be put in place so that we have better ways to provide care. And well, we lost the election, and what we worked upon was never put in place, unfortunately, because now what do we see in Quebec? they are putting in place what we planned, but 2 years later. So it's an issue.
The Premier did that big call out for, I think, 10,000 applicants to become orderlies, personal support workers. He's had a huge uptake in terms of applications. I don't know how qualified everyone is or whether they will be selected for the training. What do you think of that idea to recruit in a very urgent way people so that the military doesn't have to stay there beyond, a couple more months potentially?
In this crisis situation, I think that's the only thing we can do. 2 months ago, I said pay them more, like what they did in BC. What we saw in BC is that they put measures like funding measures for personnel that had a success. They kept their personnel. Now, in Quebec, we lost and didn't bring back that personnel until government did, as I suggested, raise their salaries. Now they're coming in. But the problem I see, not the problem I see, but I hope it won't work at that level, and I'll be clearer on this. When we look at training, nurses training, only 60% of trainees do complete their training. I think it's going to be the same thing for orderlies, and this is something that is not related to qualifications. The thing is what we see is that when they get on floors, into real practice, they see that it doesn't fit for them, and then they abandon. So there's a great number of people coming in today. Will they be there at the end of the training? That's to be seen. But on a regular situation, only 60% of trainees coming in a nursing program will go to the end of it, and when they leave because they feel that this kind of work, when they get on floors, is not right for them. And that's fine. It's just that we have a big number today. When they see in reality what it's all about, I hope there will be enough at the end.
The Prime Minister has mused about national, perhaps, guidelines for long-term care homes, and we're really, not very far down the road with that conversation. What do you think that would be useful if there were some sort of agreed upon between the federal government and provinces guidelines on how long-term care centers should be operated and run?
Look, I looked into that when I was in office, and the only message I have to send across today is quite simple. We know what to do. We know what to do in terms of home care. We know what to do in terms of institution care. And at the end of the day, it costs money. And if we were to do things really, really, really right, we would have to increase our healthcare budget across the country by about 10 to 12%. Are we ready to do that? It's not about knowing what to do. It's about funding and do what we need to do. And to this point, and you know very well that I fought for a funding increase. I was not successful into that, but the answer is there. So if the Premier is calling for new guidelines or standards and stuff like that, no problem. But there will be a cost to that. And that cost, to my knowledge today, no province can, or territory can bear it.
But if the federal government were willing to agree to more money, should provinces, including Quebec, accept some strings attached to that money?
This would not be my responsibility. It's quite sure that if I'd be in office, I'd give you the regular answer, which is that this is a provincial jurisdiction. And you could tell me that we could do more ourselves, but it's always the same thing. We're trying to do the best possible in all healthcare fields, and there are highs and lows. But at the end of the day, if we are in the future in this aging country, to do the right thing, there will have to be a significant healthcare funding in the near future. And that goes to what we've been fighting for 5-6 years ago, which is an increase in HCT, health transfers from others.
I'll leave it on this, Dr. Barrette. When you were working as an orderly in the long-term care home, were you worried about your own health? I don't know whether you felt you were well protected with PPE, but were you worried about your own health at all?
Yes, I was a bit, because I have probably all the risk factors that do exist for having a bad a bad COVID-19 presentation, let's put it that way. But I was well protected when I went into that facility. But the other thing is that, I was trained in my life. Previous I'm a physician, so I knew how exactly to utilize that equipment. That was not the case for everybody, though. And in Quebec, we lacked a lot of PPEs and also a lack of proper training to use that equipment as compared to what's happened in other provinces. So there is a day one to this crisis. And in Quebec, the story starts with not being well prepared in terms of having the right quantity or a significant quantity of PPEs at the very beginning. And we know the rest of the story.
Dr. Barrette, thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Nice to see you. Dr. Gaétan Barrette is the MNA for Lapinière, a former Quebec health minister, and of course a doctor as well. We are standing by, as we do, for the federal briefing with cabinet ministers and public health officials. Today we are going to get updated national modeling numbers, which will paint a picture on how we are doing containing this pandemic nationally. But let me give you a couple of statistics to keep in mind that are very specific to the two provinces that remain the most problematic for COVID-19, and that is, of course, Ontario and Quebec. They now represent 93% of the majority of COVID-19 cases in this country, 629 new cases just yesterday. In the rest of Canada, 25. So even with these national modeling numbers that we will get today, important to remember, and certainly Dr. Theresa Tam has been saying this consistently, this is a regional epidemic, and in at least Ontario and Quebec, it is still very challenging in terms of getting it under control in a significant way compared to the rest of the country. Before we go to that, though, I want to go to my colleague Susan Ormiston, who is in Minneapolis, if I'm not mistaken. She is standing by there because we are expecting a memorial to happen this afternoon for George Floyd. Susan, what is the scene like there today?
Good morning, Rosemary. We're standing outside North Central University in Minneapolis. Indeed, the first memorial for George Floyd is expected to begin here in about 2 hours from now. We've already seen the casket carrying his body enter the sanctuary here. We're expecting a lot of family who've flown in from all over the United States. He had an extended family in many different parts of this country, many of them from Texas. This is a memorial, it's not a funeral. That will be in Houston next week, but it is the first time that he has been formally eulogized, and Reverend Al Sharpton is going to give the eulogy. And our colleagues at Radio Canada spoke to Mr. Sharpton this morning, and he was saying things like he believes this is a new day. He remarked on the protests and demonstrations we've seen all over the United States in the past week, saying young and old, as many whites marching as blacks. He believes that this is a turning point, a new day, and he added to our colleagues, and since you're from Canada, I won't be using a 21-second delay before I have to say something in my eulogy, of course referencing Prime Minister Trudeau with that very long pause when he was asked about President Trump's comments the other day. So that has rippled out all over the place, and Sharpton even referenced it this morning, Rosemary.
Since the decision yesterday for 3 of the other officers involved to be charged, have things, I don't know, calmed down? I don't know if calmed down is the right word, but obviously
so,
that
Rosemary,
was...
I'm not quite hearing you now. We're having a lot of interference here this morning, but the other thing that's happening in Minneapolis today is that the officers who were charged yesterday, the 3 other officers involved in this, in the death of George Floyd, are appearing in court this afternoon. They have been charged with aiding and abetting murder, and the charge against Derek Chauvin, who was the police officer who kneeled on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, his charge was elevated to second-degree murder from third-degree. He is not appearing in court today, as far as we know. But these court cases now are proceeding as well at the same time as these memorials. It was very important to the Floyd family, they said, that those charges be laid before they started the memorial. And in fact, that is indeed what happened yesterday. As I said, there will be a number of different memorials for Floyd starting today here in Minneapolis. There's another there's another on Saturday, and then the formal funeral with some very important guests coming to Houston on Tuesday. Rosemary.
Okay, Susan Ormiston, we'll leave it there given your telex problems. Thank you so much, though. I appreciate it. Susan Ormiston, she's in Minneapolis today. All right, I'll bring back my colleagues, Catherine Cullen and Vashi Kapelis, as we await for officials to arrive at this briefing for COVID-19. As I was saying before we got to Susan, there are all sorts of IFB problems, but we got her on, which was important. It is a different picture here in Quebec and Ontario. So even though we might get a picture, and maybe this is what the Prime Minister was sort of hinting at, that shows that we have made a huge amount of progress in large parts of this country, there are still provinces that are that have real problems in terms of not only number of new cases, but also number of deaths, which continue to occur primarily in Ontario and Quebec, Vashi.
Yeah, and hospitalizations to add to that, too. And I listened closely to the way in which the Prime Minister sort of described what we were going to be seeing. And he did very much indicate there are many parts of the country where this has slowed, almost stopped. But then he said, and he made sure to emphasize something that we've heard previously, but we're not out of the woods yet. And, you know, the indication that he seemed to get at and what is obvious when you look at any of the data is that where we're really not out of the woods is in Ontario and to a certain degree, maybe a little bit of a lesser degree, but certainly in Quebec as well. And you're right to point to not just the number of new cases. There's a whole host of different data that we can look at, for example, the number of deaths, but also the number of hospitalizations and people who continue to be in the ICU. Remember, all of these restrictions came into place so that we could sort of stem the flow of people into, what are capped levels of ICUs across the country and hospitalizations as well. And so that worked for the most part, but in Quebec and in mostly Ontario, there are still pretty high rates of hospitalization due to COVID-19. I also wanted to touch on something that I heard in your interview with Dr. Barrett, and it reminded me of a question the Prime Minister received, and that is that we should remember just a week ago we were talking about the military's reports, I think it was a week ago, the military's reports into the long-term care homes that they are in both Ontario and Quebec. In Ontario, that stay has been extended until the middle of June, so at least another, I think, 8 or 10 days. In Quebec, the Premier there has asked for the military to stay all the way until the middle of September. They also put out a call for 10,000 positions that they have to fill in order to sort of augment the issue that the military is addressing right now. They received last night, Christopher Skeet told me, more than 70,000 applications for those positions. The question is, how fast can those people get trained, and will that actually sort of replace what the military is doing? And then the bigger question, the one the Prime Minister received and why I was reminded of it during your interview, is whether or not the military will actually stay until the middle of September, because the Defense Minister has signaled that that isn't sustainable. And the Prime Minister did not have a direct answer to that at this point, but said that those discussions are happening right now.
Okay, Vashi, thank you for that, and Catherine as well. I'll be back to both of you. Sorry, are we going to go to this briefing or we're not? Okay, I'm going to bring you to Edmundston, New Brunswick, where there was a shooting and a woman was killed overnight. Let's take a listen.
Oui, présentement, c'est ça. C'est les agents de la GRC puis Saint-Jean qui sont ici pour processer la scène, c'est-à-dire faire l'analyse des lieux avec l'identité judiciaire, recueillir toute la preuve là, qui peut se trouver sur les lieux de la scène.
Pourquoi deux services de police différents?
Ben, pour l'instant, je ne peux pas vraiment répondre. C'est ce qui nous a été envoyé là, par la GRC, possiblement.
This is at Edmundston Police saying that they are looking at the crime scene where one woman was shot overnight. That investigation continues, but I'm going to bring you back now to Ottawa. Once we have translation on this scrum, we will bring it to you. I'll bring you back now to Ottawa, though, where the COVID-19 briefing with health ministers and public health officials is about to begin, and will release their national modeling on COVID-19. Let's go there now.
Additional challenges and expenses for seniors. Groceries cost more, and deliveries come at a premium. Prescription dispensing fees have increased in many provinces. In April, more than 4 million low to middle income seniors received a supplementary GST credit automatically in their bank accounts from the Government of Canada. Today, we're announcing that the one-time tax-free payment for seniors will be received on the week of July the 6th. This automatic payment will provide $2.5 billion of support for seniors eligible for the old age security, with extra support for those eligible for the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the allowance and this allowance for the survivor. For a low-income senior couple on GIS, the April and July payments will add up to over $1,500 in support to help with increased costs caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Au total, cela représente
in total, that represents more than $1,500 in support for a low-income couple.
Our objective has been to get this payment to seniors as quickly and simply as possible. We know seniors are more targeted for fraud than others, and they have already been targeted for benefit scams. That's why we're making the one-time payment automatic, to help prevent fraud. Seniors do not need to apply, and they should not share any personal or banking information to receive it. Pour éviter les fraudes,
in order to avoid fraud, the payment is automatic.
Complements other federal supports for seniors during the pandemic, which is including $500 million to charities and community groups that help seniors and others get essential services and supplies, such as the delivery of groceries. $2,000 a month for those who lost their job due to COVID-19, regardless of pension benefits. Temporarily extending the GIS and allowance payments for those who are experiencing difficulties submitting their taxes to ensure the most vulnerable seniors continue to receive the benefits they depend upon. We reduced the mandatory withdrawal requirements by 25% for registered retirement income funds to protect seniors' investments during the volatile market, and improving seniors' quality of life and reducing social isolation through the New Horizons for Seniors program. We continue to look at all the ideas that are coming in on how we could better help seniors. During these unprecedented times, we'll always be there for Canadian seniors. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Deb. I would now turn to Dr. Tan.
Good afternoon. I'll start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 93,441 confirmed cases, including 7,543 deaths, and 51,445, or 55% of cases, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,787,000 people for COVID-19 to date, with about 5% of these testing positive overall. And in the past week, we've been testing an average of close to 29,000 people daily. We thought we'll take this opportunity to go into a little bit more detail on our data.
Bonjour. Comme d'habitude, je commencerai par énoncer les plus récents chiffres sur la COVID-19 au Canada.
I will begin by discussing recent data on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 92,748 confirmed cases, with 7,495 deaths. Laboratories throughout Canada have tested COVID-19 for 1,747,000 individuals, and results for about 7% were positive. Over the past week, we have been testing an average of close to 29,000 people daily. These numbers are changing quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus.
So slide 2. So as we proceed with relaxation of public health measures to reopen society, data and modelling reinforce that core public health measures are essential for maintaining control of Canada's COVID-19 epidemic.
Diapositive 2. À mesure que nous procédons à l'assouplissement des mesures de santé publique,
as we proceed with relaxation of public health measures to reopen society, data and modeling reinforce that core public health measures are essential for maintaining control of Canada's COVID-19 epidemic.
Slide 3. The epidemiology of COVID-19 in Canada highlights clear regional differences, with the highest number of cases concentrated in our 4 most populous provinces. Quebec and Ontario account for the vast majority of cases overall, and community transmission hotspots persist in and around the Toronto and Montreal areas. So If you look at the box to the right, we're seeing that the proportion of confirmed cases who have died has increased to 8% on June the 2nd. And based on available information, and that actually reflects, of course, the impact on our seniors. Based on available information, 16% of cases have required hospitalization, and just over 3% have required intensive care. So, of course, as we all know, the lab-confirmed cases are an underestimate of the total number of people infected in Canada.
Diapositive 3. L'épidémiologie de la COVID-19 au
Slide
Canada.
3. The epidemiology of COVID-19 in Canada highlights regional differences, with the highest number of cases concentrated in our four most populous provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia. Quebec and Ontario account for 86% of cases overall, and community transmission hotspots persist in and around Toronto and Montreal. If we look at the box to the right, the lower box, regarding the proportion of deaths, the proportion of cases who have died has increased to 8% on June 2nd, reflecting the tragic impact on Canada's seniors in long-term care. Based on available information, 16% of cases have required hospitalization, and just over 3% have required intensive care.
So although people of any age, gender, or health status can develop COVID-19, some people are at higher risk for hospitalization and death, such as older adults and people of all ages with chronic medical or immune-compromising health conditions. Currently, adults aged 60 years and older account for the majority of the hospitalizations, critical care admissions, and deaths. Tragically, over 82% of deaths are linked to long-term care and seniors' homes, where outbreaks have been occurring since the outset.
Diapositive 4.
Slide 4. Although people of any age, gender, or health status can develop COVID-19, some people are at higher risk for hospitalization and death, such as older adults and people of all ages with chronic medical or immune-compromising health conditions. Currently, adults aged 60 years and older account for the majority of the hospitalizations, critical care admissions, and deaths. Tragically, over 82% of deaths are linked to long-term care and seniors' homes, where outbreaks have been occurring ever since the outset of COVID-19.
Slide 5. All age groups have been affected, although the number of cases among children and youth has remained low. Young and middle-aged adults account for the majority of cases early on and through to the present. These are represented by the blue and the red lines on the graph. The sharp peak of cases in adults aged 80 years and older is largely due to outbreaks in long-term care homes in Quebec and Ontario. This is represented by the green line.
Diapositive 5.
Slide 5. All age groups have been affected, although the number of cases among children and youth has remained low. Young and middle-aged adults account for the majority of cases early on and through to the present, as we can see on the red and blue lines. The sharp peak of cases in adults aged 80 years and older is largely due to outbreaks in long-term care homes in Quebec and Ontario, as we can see on the green line.
Slide 6. Quebec and Ontario cases account for over 90% of the national case count over the past 14 days. No community transmission has occurred to date in Prince Edward Island, the Northwest Territories, or the Yukon. There have been 0 cases reported today in Nunavut. So this slide demonstrates the clear that there are regional epidemics in Canada.
Diapositive 6.
Slide 6. Quebec and Ontario cases account for over 90% of the national case count over the past 14 days. No community transmission has occurred to date in Prince Edward Island, the Northwest Territories, or the Yukon. There have been 0 cases reported to date in Nunavut.
Slide 7. COVID-19 has exploited social and economic vulnerabilities and inequalities across Canadian society, taking hold in settings and among communities who experience overcrowding, lower incomes, and health disparities. Long-term care and assisted living homes have been hit the hardest, with more than 900 separate outbreaks accounting for about 18% of confirmed cases and 82% of all deaths. Outbreaks in other congregate living and work settings are also driving case counts in some provinces. These settings include acute care, daycares, correctional facilities, and workplaces, including Canada's largest outbreak linked to a meat processing plant.
Diapositive 7.
Slide 7. COVID-19 has exploited social and economic vulnerabilities and inequalities across Canadian society, taking hold in settings and among communities who experience overcrowded, lower incomes, and health disparities. Long-term care and assisted living homes have been hit the hardest, with more than 900 separate outbreaks accounting for about 18% of confirmed cases, and tragically, 82% of all deaths. Outbreaks in other congregate living and work settings are also driving case counts in some provinces. These settings include acute care settings, daycares, correctional facilities, and workplaces, including Canada's largest outbreak linked to a meat processing plant.
Slide 8. So one way we monitor whether the epidemic is coming under control is to look at how many other people a single infected person can spread the infection to. This is represented by a number called the RT, which stands for the effective reproduction number. Fluctuations in the RT reflect ongoing transmission in areas across the country, especially in and around Toronto and Montreal. Overall, the RT for Canada is currently below 1. But we will need to keep RT consistently below 1 for more than 3 weeks before we can be sure that our public health measures are effectively controlling the epidemic.
Diapositive 8. L'une des façons pour nous de mesurer le degré de maîtrise de l'épidémie.
One way we monitor whether the epidemic is coming under control is to look at how many other people a single infected person can spread the infection to. This is represented by a number, RT, which stands for effective reproduction number. Fluctuations in the RT reflect ongoing transmission in areas around the country, especially in and around Canada's most populous cities, Toronto and Montreal, as well as the communities around these cities. Overall, the RT for Canada is currently below 1, but we will need to keep RT consistently below 1 for more than 3 weeks before we can be sure that our public health measures are effectively controlling the epidemic.
Slide 9. So based on updated case data, this short-term forecasting shows predicted cases and deaths due to COVID-19 out to June 15th. On the left, the predicted number of cases could be in the range of 98,000 to 107,500 by June 15th. On the right, the predicted number of deaths could be in the range of 7,700 to 9,400 by June 15th.
Diapositive 9.
Slide 9. Based on updated Canadian real data, this short-term forecasting shows predicted cases and deaths due to COVID-19 out to June 15th. On the left, the predicted number of cases could be in the range of 98,000 to 107,500 by June 15th. On the right, the predicted number of deaths could be in the range of 7,700 to 9,400 by June 15th.
Slide 10. So models provide a prediction of what could happen under different scenarios, allowing us to drive our public health action towards a best possible outcome. We continue to use models on an ongoing basis to help us identify which combinations of public health measures applied with what intensity are most likely to reinforce epidemic control.
Diapositive 10. Les modèles fournissent une
Slide 10.
prédiction de ce qui
Modeling
pourrait
is
se
a tool
produire
to
dans les
explore
scénarios
different
hypothétiques
scenarios,
et ce qui nous permet de mener nos actions de santé
allowing
publique
us to
pour
drive
obtenir
our
le
public
meilleur
health actions
résultat
toward a
possible.
best possible
Nous
outcome.
continuons à utiliser continuellement
We continue to
des modèles
use
pour nous
models
aider
on
à
an ongoing
déterminer
basis
quelles
to help us
combinaisons de
identify
mesures de
which
santé
combinations
publique
of public health
appliquées
measures,
avec quelle intensité
applied with what intensity,
sont le plus susceptibles
are most
de
likely to
renforcer
reinforce
le contrôle
epidemic
des
control.
épidémies.
Slide 11. Some of you may have seen this graph before, but it illustrates the potential impact of public health measures on the size and duration of the epidemic under 3 possible scenarios. So we have been aiming for that smaller green curve, which represents the best case scenario, where each infected person only transmits to less than one other person on average.
Diapositive 11. Ce graphique illustre les répercussions
Slide 11.
potentielles des mesures de santé
This graph
publique
illustrates the
sur la
potential
taille et
impact
la
of
durée
public
de
health
l'épidémie
measures on the
selon
size and
3
duration of the
scénarios
epidemic
possibles
under
utilisés
3
pour la
possible
planification.
scenarios that were used for
Nous visons
planning.
la courbe verte plus petite qui représente le
We are
meilleur
aiming for
scénario
the
où
green
chaque
smaller
personne
curve,
infectée
which
transmet
represents a
l'infection en
best
moyenne
case
à
scenario
moins
where each
d'une
infected
autre
person only
personne.
transmits to less than one other person on average.
Without a vaccine or treatments, public health measures remain essential to control the epidemic. If we're loosening distancing, this must be accompanied by enhancements to other public health measures, including case detection, contact tracing, and quarantine, to prevent new introductions and to identify and control any new transmission chains. These models all tell us that if we relax too much or too soon, the epidemic will most likely rebound with explosive growth as a distinct possibility.
Diapositive 12. Sans vaccin ni traitement, les mesures de santé
Slide
publique
12.
restent
Without a
essentielles
vaccine or
pour
treatments,
contrôler
public
l'épidémie.
health measures remain
Le
essential to
relâchement
control
de
the
l'éloignement
epidemic.
physique doit s'accompagner
Loosening
d'un
distancing
renforcement
must be
des autres
accompanied
mesures
by
de santé
enhancements to
publique,
other public health
notamment la
measures,
détection des cas,
including
la
case
recherche des
detection,
contacts et la
contact
mise en
tracing,
quarantaine,
and quarantine,
afin de prévenir des
to
nouvelles
prevent new
introductions
introductions
et de repérer
and to
et
identify and
contrôler
control
toute nouvelle
any
chaîne
new
de
transmission
transmission.
chains.
Ces modèles nous indiquent
These models tell us
tous que si nous ne les
that if we
assouplissons
relax
pas
too much
suffisamment ou
or
trop
too
tôt,
soon,
l'épidémie risque fort
the
de
epidemic will
rebondir
most
et de
likely
connaître une
rebound
montée en flèche.
with explosive growth.
Slide 13. This slide compares Canada's COVID-19 trajectory with other countries. And Canada's public health efforts to slow epidemic growth shows that we were able to bend and flatten the curve sooner than a number of countries. Other countries, such as South Korea and Japan, demonstrated strong epidemic control to keep their curve smaller overall. But all countries realize that this is an ongoing effort, requiring sustained public health measures to avoid new outbreaks and or rebound in epidemic activity.
Diapositive 13. Cette diapositive compare les trajectoires
Slide
de
13.
COVID-19 au
This
Canada
slide compares Canada's
avec celles d'autres
COVID-19
pays.
trajectory with other
Les
countries.
efforts déployés par le Canada en matière de santé publique pour ralentir
Canada's
la
public health
croissance de
efforts to
l'épidémie
slow epidemic
montrent que
growth
nous avons pu
show
aplatir la
that we were
courbe
able
plus
to
rapidement
bend and
que
flatten the
plusieurs
curve
autres
sooner
pays.
than a number of
D'autres
countries.
pays, comme la Corée du Sud et le Japon, ont pris des
Other
solides
countries,
mesures
such
de
as South
contrôle de
Korea and
l'épidémie
Japan,
pour
demonstrated
maintenir
strong
la courbe
epidemic
à un
control
niveau
to keep their
généralement
curves
plus
smaller
bas, mais
overall.
tous les pays se rendent compte qu'il s'agit
But all
d'un
countries
effort
realize that
continu
this is an
et nécessite
ongoing
des
effort,
mesures de santé publique
requiring
soutenues
sustained
pour
public health
éviter de
measures
nouvelles éclosions
to
ou
avoid
le
new
rebond de
outbreaks
l'activité épidémique.
and or rebound epidemic activity.
Slide 14. Canada has made significant progress to bring the epidemic under control, thanks to the commitment of Canadians who are following public health advice to protect themselves and others. Until there is a vaccine or effective treatment, we must carefully balance the risks associated with spread of COVID-19 with the unintended social and health consequences of restrictive public health measures. Jurisdictions across the country are taking a gradual, phased approach to increasing social and economic activity, with appropriate conditions and controls in place to minimize serious illness, death, and burden on the healthcare system. Priority areas include rapid identifying and isolating cases, trace and quarantine contacts, continue to increase healthcare and public health capacity, provide a high degree of protection for vulnerable populations and settings, including supporting workplaces, and engage communities to practice core personal public health measures. Thank you.
Diapositive 14.
Slide 14. Canada has made significant progress to bring the epidemic under control, thanks to the commitment of Canadians who are following public health advice to protect themselves and others. Until there is a vaccine or effective treatment, we must carefully balance the risks associated with spread of COVID-19 with the unintended social and health consequences of restrictive public health measures. Jurisdictions across the country are taking a gradual, phased approach to increasing social and economic activity with appropriate conditions and controls in place to minimize serious illness, death, and burden on the healthcare system. Priority areas include rapidly identify and isolate cases, trace and quarantine contacts, continue to increase healthcare and public health capacity, provide a high degree of protection for vulnerable populations and settings, including supporting workplaces, and finally, engage communities to practice core personal public health measures. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Tam et Dr. New. Donc, de bonnes nouvelles.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tam, Dr. New. Good news today. Firstly, the situation is improving throughout Canada, but we need to be cautious. We need to continue our efforts in order to maintain the progress made over the past few weeks. Another piece of good news is the assistance to seniors who built our country, our parents, our grandparents. This is a difficult situation for seniors, both the health and the economic situations. Given high prices and the increase in prices for drugs and transit, among others, Mr. Trudeau announced this morning that in the week of the 6th of July, there will be additional assistance between $300 and $500 per senior. And this is added to the GST credit on the 9th of April. That was for 60% of seniors, which meant that for seniors living alone, the total assistance will go from $300 to $900, and for seniors who are part of a couple, the assistance can go from $600 to $1,500. So the total amount, $900 for single seniors and $1,500 for seniors in a couple. Those are some of the amounts seniors will receive. I would add, these are one-time, non-taxable payments. Because they're non-taxable, seniors will know that they can keep all of the payment, and one-time, because that way they won't have to wait to receive the amounts. I would also add that these payments will be made automatically. No application is necessary. And that will reduce opportunities for fraud, which could have occurred otherwise. I would also add that 98% of seniors will receive these deposits by direct deposit, which will also allow this to occur more quickly. This will enable seniors to get through this crisis more easily. And now we're ready to take your questions.
As usual, we're going to start with 3 questions on the phone, 1 question, 1 follow-up before we turn to the room. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question nous vient de Philippe Vincent Coisy avec Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour à vous tous. J'ai une question qui va être pour
question.
Nous et monsieur,
I have a question for Mr. New and Mr. Duclos.
Monsieur New, à quel point ce serait important d'avoir des données
Mr. New,
sur les cas de COVID-19, mais des données
to what extent is it important to have ethnic-specific data on COVID-19 for racialized or indigenous communities? This has been asked for a great deal. Isn't this important?
Merci pour la question. Oui,
Answer. Thank you for the question. Yes, Indeed, it is important to have exhaustive data. Currently, we have reports on specific outbreaks and situations which have occurred in certain locations and establishments with vulnerable populations. For example, homeless shelters. It is clear that apart from seniors in long-term care centers, COVID-19 has also disproportionately affected other vulnerable populations. And that is a reflection of our society's inequalities. Poverty, overpopulated households. All of that can lead to increased risk for some populations. We are currently in active discussions with our public health counterparts in the provinces and territories. Everyone is on the same page. But there are still issues to be discussed in order to operationalize what we're going to do for all of Canada. Thank you. Minister Duclos, answer. Very quickly, because Dr. New stated most of the answer that I believe is important, I would say that it is important to have disaggregated data on cultural and ethnic effects, and I believe that public health agencies in the provinces are increasingly giving this information. More generally, it is clear that the blood testing that will be generated soon will be able to tell us who tested positive and who has received, or who rather had COVID-19, because there's a difference between those tested and those who actually were infected with the virus. This data will be distributed. We are working closely with the provinces, and we will draw information from this data. Firstly, and this is something we already knew, poor, vulnerable, isolated, fearful populations are too often left to their own devices, and in a public health context, this is not only negative for these populations, but for the entire community. And the other thing that we will draw from this data is how to reduce the spread of this virus in contexts like Dr. New mentioned. For example, in situations where there are housing issues for seniors, for example, and more generally, where there's a bad housing situation, bad not only morally and socially, but also on a health level. Question, in terms of timelines, when will we have this data, and what is going wrong with the provinces? You say you're in discussion, but if everyone was really on the same page, I feel we would have the data. What's not working? Answer, when it comes to discussions with provinces, I will let Dr. New answer. Dr. New, I would say that there's perhaps a lack of people on the ground in the last few weeks. With everything that's happened in the provinces and territories with the outbreaks, people are very busy on the ground. And in order to do contact tracing and so on, how to say? Well, it requires a lot of resources. It's not just about how to collect the data. To date, we have data on Indigenous communities, but not all provinces and territories gather this data in a regular fashion. There's still issues to be resolved. Another aspect is even if we wanted to gather socioeconomic data and other data, we also want to avoid stigmatizing and discriminating. We don't want to get into a situation where we're victim blaming people who have been affected or infected. That's another aspect. Additionally, as Minister Duclos said, we also need to ensure that data privacy is protected. We need disaggregated data. And when we're talking about isolated communities, it can be difficult to fully anonymize the data. So these are difficult issues, and we are discussing with our counterparts.
Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Ryan Tumulty with the National Post. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yeah, good morning, or good afternoon, Dr. Tam. I'm wondering, in previous modeling efforts, and we've certainly heard this from other agencies across the country, that data has been an issue. I'm wondering, with this modeling, are you confident that you're getting enough good data from the province to be able to predict where the pandemic is going?
So yes, so we've been working hard with province and territory. Some of the models don't use specific case-based data, but use a lot of research on parameters of disease characteristics, like the incubation period or the period of infectivity, that type of thing. So it depends on which model you're looking at. What we now have, approximately 99% of the case-based information now from provinces and territories, which is great, and it gives us the basic demographic information. But we are missing some data points, such as the race and ethnicity data that based on the last question. But we do have now almost all of the case information forms. And there are some fields that are missing still, especially the final outcomes of what happened to people, but those will get filled over time. So I think based on that information, what you've seen in the short-term forecasting projections, that's the one that uses the actual case data. The other types of modeling is based on a wide-ranging amount of information collected through international research, as much as it is domestic, to model those parameters on disease dynamics and transmission. And so those gets updated as well, so that the disease spread models and the dynamic models that you've seen, for the most part, all of them demonstrate that if we relax certain things too soon, if we don't continue these public health measures, there's a very high likelihood of some sort of rebound and resurgence.
Ryan, follow up?
Yeah, I'm also wondering, the data you're showing today shows that crowded places like meat plants and work camps and shelters have all had significant outbreaks. I know just recently there was reports of outbreaks amongst temporary foreign workers in farming operations in Ontario. Do you think more needs to be done in sort of these crowded work settings to ensure that there aren't more outbreaks and thus more community spread?
That is an absolutely vital aspect of controlling the epidemic and going forwards. I think the collective amount of global information, but also in Canada, shows enclosed, crowded spaces, close contacts, lead to what we might call these bigger or larger clusters, or sometimes what we call super spreading events. Those are the kind of settings that's becoming quite evident. So as Canada experienced some of these outbreaks, a lot has been learned. So we've, as the Chief Medical Officer of Health, shared the information in the Special Advisory Committee. We've been really focusing on learning what kind of protocols and processes need to be put in place, particularly infection prevention control in certain settings in the workplaces, such as the meat packing plants. But not only that, is that more actual analysis of the social connects beyond just the workplace, but the crowded living conditions, perhaps of the workers, and their linkage then to the wider community is another area that we've learned about. So it's not just the workplace, but the transportation between someone's home and the workplace, but also the homes themselves if they're in crowded conditions. And so in order to address that, it takes a complex set of programs and policies, some of which you've actually heard about. Long-term care, absolutely. That is, knowing everything that we know. Protecting a resurgence means absolutely escalating best practices in all of those settings. We've also been working with Correctional Services Canada and provinces and territories to ensure that the infection control protocols for prevention, but also what to do rapidly if they detect a case in correctional facilities. There's now protocols in place to rapidly test and then manage those outbreaks. So it's in every single one of these settings. And of course, the Minister of Health may want to comment, but we're working quite closely now with other government departments on looking at what more we can do to support temporary foreign workers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Dr. Tam said, there's, no secret that the crowded conditions that people live in are driving these outbreaks. And so I've already spoken with my colleague, Minister Qualtrough, about what more we can do to ensure that temporary foreign workers have appropriate accommodations. We've seen outbreaks now in BC and most recently in Ontario. And we know that these workers are critical to our agricultural sector, but we also know that their health is critical to the health of Canadians that live in and amongst them, and as well their own health, which, by the way, they're often far away from their own home. And so we've already tragically lost a temporary foreign worker in this most recent outbreak, and so we will be working together to make sure that temporary foreign workers are protected, and so are the communities in which they are living.
Merci, Madame la Ministre Opérateur. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Catherine Lévesque avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Mes questions sont pour Dr. New.
Question. I have a question for Dr. New on modeling. Firstly, on deaths and on what you said could occur before the 15th of June between 7,700 and 9,400. We're already close to 7,700 on the 4th of June, so I would like to ask whether we're still in the scenarios in this modeling, or if with the reopening that we've seen recently, I'm wondering if that number is going up faster than expected. Answer. Thank you for the question. It's always hard with modeling. It's not a crystal ball. We do our best with the data based on what's currently occurring, for example, in long-term care centers. Because that is the place that is currently the site of the most deaths in Canada. Now, with what's occurring in Ontario and Quebec, with the Canadian Armed Forces, that has helped. They are there to help the public health authorities in both provinces. Currently, with the deaths we have now, that reflects what's occurred. That reflects what we did 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as for the measures we're taking now, we'll see the results of that later. We hope we'll see lower infections and deaths, but only in 2 to 4 weeks. So with our range of models, we're estimating between 7,700 and 9,400 deaths by June 15th, and currently we're still looking to be between those extremes. Follow-up question. On page 12 of your presentation, you have 2 graphs. One graph that shows the current curve, which is going down, and then in the other graph, we see a sudden spike in cases. in October in the fall. I would like to ask what could potentially lead to that increase in cases in the fall. Do you think we're moving towards such a scenario? Answer. Thank you for the question. I'm not trying to scare Canadians, but it's really what we all do as Canadians throughout the country. So far, we've all worked hard and we've flattened the curve, but now the challenge is that with summer and the good weather, everyone is going to be leaving their homes, and it can be difficult to always remember to practice good public health measures. We've mentioned many times these important measures. We need to continue to respect physical distancing, good habits like frequently washing your hands, and if you're in a situation where you can't physically distance, then you could consider using a non-medical mask or a face covering if, for example, you're on public transit or at the grocery store. We're hoping to avoid a scenario like that. But if people find this too difficult, and of course with the loosening of measures in each province and territory, we always need to remember public health principles, even if each of these measures is loosened. Of course, we also need to help the economy recover. We need to allow businesses to open, but we need to strike a balance. We want to avoid a scenario where there's another spike. Thank you.
About just slide 12 and the differences between...
Oh, slide 12, yes. Looking at slide 12 in terms of what happens between now and the fall, at the end of the day, it all depends on what Canadians do across the country because, you know, with the nice weather, with the summer coming, people going out, it's sometimes more difficult to remember that you have to remember, you know, to keep practicing all those important public health measures, keeping a physical distancing where appropriate or where you can of 2 meters. If it's not possible, wearing a face covering or non-medical mask, also frequently washing your hands, all those things that we've repeated many times. And if we do that as a country, then I think we're in a good shape and not going to have this, how you say, resurgence of cases in the fall. But if we don't as a country, then that's what might happen. And of course, the challenge is, of course, as well, is that as we try to, like you say, restart the economy, as businesses start to open up, as provinces and territories start to, as they say, relax certain measures, we all need to keep a careful eye in terms of what happens over the coming weeks and months. So hopefully we don't get into this situation in the fall.
Okay, we're going to pull away from this federal briefing right now just to wrap up a little bit of what we heard in terms of the national modeling numbers. I'll bring back Vashi Kapelis and the CBC's Catherine Cullen. And as we predicted, the picture encouraging, but quite right, very different in Ontario and Quebec. They account for 90% of the cases that have occurred just over the past 2 weeks. But there was a lot of other good information there in terms of where we're at, Vashi. What stood out there for you?
Yeah, I thought absolutely the same thing stood out to me, the very pronounced difference between Ontario and Quebec and the rest of the country. That first statistic that you outlined, that 90% of the cases in the last 14 days, and we know that every day when we kind of look at the daily numbers, but to see that very starkly presented, 90% of the cases in the last 14 days are in Ontario and Quebec. And then even more pronounced is the difference in some parts of Ontario and Quebec, which is reflected, I thought very interestingly, as Dr. Tam pointed out, in the what's known as the RT. So that's the rate at which, if I'm infected, I cause new infections. It's down below 1 and has been for a few weeks. But, and this is a big but, that's a big deal, first of all. It shows you how good things are going in the rest of the country. But there have been many fluctuations, and Dr. Tam said, due to Toronto and Montreal. Like, that is what is causing the fluctuations, and we'll need sort of the elimination of those fluctuations before you can sort of take a deep breath and say, okay, the entire country has flattened the curve. So it shows me, for example, a lot of what was presented today, that the problem is very much focused right now on Ontario and Quebec, but it's also even more so focused on the 2 big cities in those provinces, Toronto and Montreal, which we, again, anecdotally had heard, but the numbers and the data today really underscore that. And then again, of course, just another pronunciation on the degree to which seniors and people in long-term care homes have been affected by this. 82% of all the deaths across this country are linked to, due to COVID-19, are linked to long-term care and seniors' homes. So again, that has persisted even since the last update.
Yeah, exactly. That, of course, is still striking percentage to hear, and that RT number that is so encouraging. It's been below 1 for almost 2 weeks, and Dr. Tam said if we can keep going on a trajectory without the up and down that you talked about, primarily caused by Toronto and Montreal, for 3 weeks, then we're in a much better place in terms of how likely the virus is to reproduce, because when the cases are that low, it's much easier to trace where they are and to try and figure out how to stop them. Catherine, over to you.
Rosemary, I think when we first started talking about having the federal government release modeling projections, the hope from a lot of people was that this was going to give us not a crystal ball, but the government's best guess, or health officials' best guess at where we were going. Now that we've had several of these updates, and it was really emphasized by those last comments by Dr. New, we see that there is such a range of possibilities. And so I think in many ways what these modeling projections are better at telling us is what is happening right now. It's actually the snapshot. You know, Vashi was talking about the fact that the situation is worse in Toronto and Montreal. While we were on air, public health officials in Quebec releasing some new data. Montreal alone has surpassed 3,000 deaths, 316 deaths now for Montreal. Of course, across the country, we've seen some upwards of 7,500 deaths from COVID-19. So that's not quite half, but an enormous proportion, obviously, of the deaths just on the island of Montreal alone. Also, the story, as Vashi rightly mentions, about long-term care facilities. We learned today that, interestingly, women seem to be getting COVID-19 more often than men in terms of the cases that we know have been tested. Was also interesting to note, and I think important for everybody to register, that while such a great number of the deaths are happening, 94% of people above the age of 60, that doesn't mean that is who is getting COVID-19. No. In fact, Dr. Tam talked about the fact that it is young Canadians, middle-aged Canadians that are actually the majority of the cases. But who is dying? Well, one thing that we do know from this data is that it is the elderly. Certainly, we still don't have some of that race-based data, too, that people have been talking about, particularly in recent weeks, to get a sense of how that is playing into all of this.
Okay, thank you both very much for your coverage. I appreciate it. Vashi Capellas, you can watch her at 5 Eastern on her show, Power and Politics, and Catherine Cullen. Thank you very much. I will just point to one more slide that I think is worth remembering, and that is slide one of the last slides that they showed us in that briefing that showed that if we relax too much on our public health measures, Dr. Tam said the virus could rebound with, quote, explosive growth. So that means physical distancing, hand washing, all of those things still important as we enter into a different phase in most parts of the country. I will leave you there with our coverage here on CBC News Network today. Andrew Nichols picks up after this short break, and I will see you back tomorrow. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks for watching.